Not on the list. The security guard's voice carried over the velvet rope, hard and dismissive. The scanner light flashed red, and he shoved her invitation back as though it were fake. A couple behind her breezed through without a glance. Elara Vaughn stood frozen, holding her ID out again, but the guard sneered. "Lady, anyone can print these at Kinko's. Don't waste my time." Whispers flared. One woman smirked. "She's bold. I'll give her that. Showing up here dressed like she belongs." A man leaned closer to his date, muttering, "God, she thinks she's one of us." Their laughter stung sharper than the winter wind. Elara, in her emerald gown, stood tall. But the disrespect escalated. The guard waved over another staffer. "Check this one. She looks like trouble." They examined her ID again, loud enough for the line to hear. "This picture doesn't even look like you. Are you sure this is real?" When she finally stepped inside, the ballroom swallowed her in its glitter. Chandeliers blazed, tuxedos gleamed, cigars smoldered. Yet the microaggressions clung. A waiter thrust a tray toward her with a curt nod, muttering, "Drinks are for guests only." An older donor gripped her arm. "Sweetheart, how did you stumble into finance?" His tone dripped condescension, as if she were a misplaced intern. The final humiliation came near the bar. A cluster of Blackwood Group's junior partners spotted her. Their laughter was already loud, but now it turned cruel. "Look at this one," one sneered. "Another diversity hire. You know how they love their quotas." "Diversity hire?" Another echoed, his grin mean. "More like charity case." The third raised his glass, his voice carrying, "Hey, careful, don't trip, or you'll end up mopping the floor. That's probably what she's really here for." The three burst into laughter, the kind that draws others in. Cheap, mocking, toxic. Elara didn't respond. She stood within earshot, her face calm, her eyes steady. She absorbed their ridicule without flinching, her silence cutting deeper than any retort. And then, silence. The laughter died when a senior partner broke away from his circle and strode toward her. His voice was warm, his posture deferential. "Ms. Vaughn," he said with respect that filled the room, "we're honored you could join us. Everyone is eager for your thoughts on the final terms." The junior partners froze. Their smiles vanished, the color draining from their faces. In a single breath, they realized their mistake. The diversity hire they mocked was Elara Vaughn, CEO of Genesis Capital. The woman holding the $5 billion pen that would decide whether their firm lived or died. And if you've ever witnessed someone underestimated, you know the power of a reveal. Drop it in the comments if you're ready to see how Elara flips the script. And make sure you're subscribed, because the way this story unfolds will leave you speechless. Long before Elara Vaughn commanded billion-dollar boardrooms, she lived in houses that never quite felt like home. Her mother, a determined woman with sharp eyes and calloused hands, worked tirelessly as a small-time real estate speculator, buying fixer-uppers in the hope of building stability. But discriminatory lending made that dream a constant uphill battle. Mortgage officers smiled politely and denied her applications without hesitation. Redlining maps, though illegal on paper, still quietly determined who was safe to lend to, and black women like her mother rarely made the cut. The result was a childhood spent in motion. Elara learned what instability tasted like. The metallic tang of tap water in houses with corroded pipes. The scratch of secondhand carpet under bare feet. The sound of boxes being taped shut again just months after they were opened. In one drafty apartment, the stove doubled as a heater, its blue flame left running on winter nights when the radiators coughed out nothing but cold air. Baths were warmed pot by pot on that same stove, steam filling the kitchen as her mother carried heavy pots one by one to the tub. Yet in that struggle, Elara saw something far greater than deprivation. She saw resilience. Her mother carried unpaid bills with the same straight back that carried hope. She negotiated with landlords, juggled multiple jobs, and still found time to encourage her daughter. "This is temporary," she would say. brushing plaster dust from her palms after another failed home project. "We are building something, even if the world doesn't want us to." Those words carved themselves into Elara's bones. Where some children saw failure, she saw a blueprint, an education in how systems were designed to keep families like hers one step away from collapse. Instead of breaking her spirit, it hardened her resolve. She would master the very structures that tried to shut her mother out. Elara's ambition was not about chasing luxury for its own sake. It was about rewriting a script that had been forced onto her family and countless others. She knew her success was part of a longer lineage. Black women had been pushing against locked doors for generations, and she was determined to be one who kicked them wide open. Maggie Lena Walker became the first woman in the United States to charter a bank in 1903, daring to plant a financial institution in the middle of the Jim Crow era. In 1953, Lila St. John broke another barrier as the first Black woman to pass the New York Stock Exchange exam, defying an industry that had never imagined a Black woman holding the floor. Decades later, Joanne Price raised one of the earliest venture capital funds managed by a Black woman, and Melody Hobson rose to co-lead Ariel Investments while challenging executives everywhere to practice color bravery. These women were not isolated exceptions. They were builders of a legacy, laying stones on a road they might never fully walk, but that others, like Elara, could continue down. Their defiance against structural exclusion turned into a chorus across generations. By the time Elara entered adulthood, she carried not only her mother's sacrifices, but the echoes of those pioneers. Her drive to succeed was not fueled by greed. It was a mission to challenge the invisible lines still drawn across neighborhoods, workplaces, and boardrooms. She understood that wealth, when hoarded, meant power withheld. But wealth, when redirected, could become liberation. The flickering light of kitchen stoves used to heat bathwater. Elara Vaughn began charting a path that would one day place her in the same breath as the women who came before her. The blueprint of resilience was written in hardship, but its architecture was grand enough to hold a future measured not just in dollars, but in justice. When Elara Vaughn first entered the corporate world, she carried the same sharp intelligence that had carried her through school and early internships. What she didn't carry was the privilege of being assumed competent. From the beginning, the ground tilted against her. Her starting salary was lower than that of peers hired for the same role, something she discovered by accident when a male colleague casually joked about his bonus. The realization hit like a cold slap. She was doing the same work, but earning far less, her value discounted before she had even sat down at the table. Meetings became another battlefield. She would raise an idea, only to have it brushed aside, then resurrected minutes later by a male colleague who was instantly praised for his brilliant insight. More than once, she watched the room nod approvingly at words that were, in truth, her own. The isolation was constant. She was often the only Black woman in the room, reduced to a symbol instead of recognized as a strategist. When conversations about diversity surfaced, eyes shifted toward her, as if she were expected to speak for an entire community. She was invited to panels on inclusion, but left out of strategy sessions that actually decided the company's future. The message was clear. Her presence was valuable as decoration, not direction. The weight of these microaggressions was not in any single incident, but in their accumulation. Day after day, the subtle cuts became a steady erosion, a reminder that her place was conditional. The corporate ladder she was climbing was slick with bias, every rung demanding twice the effort for half the recognition. Yet instead of retreating, Elara sharpened her resolve. She embraced a principle that would define her leadership style: color bravery. To her, acknowledging race and gender openly was not weakness but strength. Being colorblind was an excuse corporations used to ignore inequality. By speaking truth to those dynamics, she refused to let others define her presence as accidental or token. She was not an exception to the rule. She was living proof the rules were broken. The breaking point came quietly. After yet another review where her performance was praised but her promotion delayed, she walked out of the office knowing she would not return. The glass ceiling was not simply a barrier. It was a cage designed to contain her. And cages, she decided, were meant to be left behind. Elara set out to build her own firm. It was not an act of vanity. It was survival. She understood that in order to lead without compromise, she had to create the very table others refused to seat her at. The journey, however, was brutal. Banks turned her away. Venture capital firms offered patronizing advice instead of funding. The statistics told the story she was now living. Black business owners face a loan rejection rate nearly 3 times higher than white counterparts. 61% of Black women entrepreneurs are forced to self-fund their startups, compared to far fewer among other demographics. And when they do launch, their average annual revenue barely scratches $24,000, 1/6 of what women-owned businesses overall generate. Each denial steeled her further. Where doors closed, she found windows. Where windows locked, she built entirely new structures. Out of rejection was born Genesis Capital, a firm with her vision at its core. She was no longer simply navigating the gauntlet of systemic bias. She was rewriting its design, turning her struggle into strategy and her resilience into infrastructure. Elara Vaughn had crossed the threshold from survivor to architect. The very walls that tried to contain her had become the blueprint for the empire she was building. The grand metropole ballroom buzzed with a carefully curated elegance. Champagne glasses clinked, polished laughter ricocheted off the oak-paneled walls, and waiters glided through the crowd with trays of oysters and crystal flutes. In one corner, the city's wealthiest names huddled in small knots, trading gossip disguised as strategy. Elara Vaughn stood at the edge of it all, her emerald gown catching the light in quiet defiance. She held herself with composure, her silence a shield against the subtle barbs that had followed her from the entrance. To some, her presence was invisible. To others, it was an opportunity to sneer. Across the room, 3 junior partners from the Blackwood Group leaned against the marble bar, their drinks already loosening their tongues. Their laughter rose above the hum, sharp and careless. "Look at her," one muttered, tilting his glass in Elara's direction. Another quota higher. "You can always tell." The second chuckled, leaning closer. "Yeah, diversity's the new currency. Doesn't matter if you're qualified, just tick the right box." The third smirked openly, voice dripping with contempt. "Please. She probably thinks this is her big break. More likely she's somebody's pet project. I give her 6 months before she flames out." Their words weren't whispered. They were meant to be overheard, to draw others into their derision. Their eyes lingered on Elara like predators circling prey, their laughter swelling each time one of them landed a harsher insult. But Elara did not look away. She stood within earshot, unflinching. Her stillness was unnerving, an unspoken challenge to their arrogance. Where they expected embarrassment, they found composure. Where they wanted a reaction, they were met with silence. The room itself seemed to shift. Conversations around the edges quieted, drawn to the imbalance of power playing out before them. Camera phones tilted subtly in her direction, capturing the spectacle. To most in the ballroom, it looked like another social misstep, another guest being mocked out of her place. Yet within Elara's calm eyes rested a truth no one else could see. She was not the outsider they assumed. She was the axis upon which the night's future would turn, the irony sharpened with every passing second. The junior partners reveled in their mockery, blind to the fact that their firm's survival depended on her. They believed they were laughing at a token. In reality, they were ridiculing the woman whose signature could either save or bury the Blackwood Group. Unseen, almost invisible to them, Elara carried the $5 billion pin that would soon redraw the balance of power in that very room. The laughter around the bar collapsed the instant a senior partner stepped forward. His stride cut through the crowd, his expression solemn with intent. He extended his hand to Elara, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "Ms. Vaughn," he said warmly, "we are honored you could join us. Everyone is eager to hear your perspective on the final terms." The words hung in the air like a dropped chandelier. The junior partners froze. Their smug grins dissolved into shock, their cheeks drained of color. Around them, murmurs swelled into whispers, spreading from one cluster of guests to the next. Faces turned toward Elara, eyes widening as the truth sharpened into focus. The woman they had mocked as an outsider, dismissed as a token, was the one person they could not afford to insult. She was Elara Vaughn, CEO of Genesis Capital, a fund commanding billions in assets, and the sole authority on a $5 billion investment their firm desperately needed. Elara accepted the handshake with a calm nod, her posture unchanged. She did not gloat. She did not need to. The silence of the room, the shifting expressions of those who had belittled her, spoke louder than any words she might have delivered. She crossed the room with deliberate grace, each step a quiet reclamation of dignity stolen at the door. At the head table, documents waited beneath polished silver lamps. She took her seat, unfolding the papers with the ease of someone accustomed to steering futures. The room leaned forward as though drawn by gravity. The Blackwood Group had been balancing on a razor's edge for months. Their private equity empire, once synonymous with strength, was buckling under the weight of poor bets and over-leveraged deals. Their polished facade, champagne galas and towering office suites, concealed a desperate truth. They needed Genesis Capital's funding not just to expand, but to survive. Without Elara's approval, the firm's house of cards would collapse. The irony was suffocating. The same voices that mocked her at the bar were the very ones whose paychecks, reputations, and futures depended on the ink of her signature. Their disdain had collided with their dependence, and only one of those forces would decide the night. Elara turned each page methodically, the sound of paper shifting against polished wood filling the silence. She asked questions in a measured tone, her focus razor-sharp. Every nod from her sent relief rippling through Blackwood's senior leadership. Every pause in her reading made them shift uncomfortably in their seats. The junior partners who had ridiculed her now stood at the edges, pale and silent. They avoided her gaze, as if meeting her eyes would cement the memory of their cruelty. They had laughed at a woman they thought powerless. Now they stood face to face with the truth that power had been in the room all along, and it had belonged to her. If you believe respect should never depend on someone's status, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because this moment is about to redefine power. The ballroom held its breath as Elara Vaughn set the contract before her. For most, this deal was about survival. The Blackwood Group needed an immediate injection of capital to patch the holes in their empire. But for Elara, the $5 billion on the table was never about saving a single firm. It was about rewriting the terms of power itself. The fund she had designed, Project Horizon, was built with a mission that stretched far beyond profit. Its purpose was to redirect capital toward minority-owned businesses, to create pipelines for underrepresented entrepreneurs, and to ensure that mentorship was not an afterthought but a cornerstone. For decades, Black women had been forced to create opportunities in hostile markets. Now, through this deal, Elara was building infrastructure to make sure they would never have to do it alone again. As she spoke, her tone was calm, her language precise. Genesis Capital is prepared to move forward, she began, her gaze steady on the senior partners across from her, but only under these conditions. The conditions landed like thunder in the silence. The Blackwood Group would not only accept the investment, they would commit to measurable benchmarks. A percentage of their new ventures must be minority-led. They would establish mentorship programs pairing senior executives with diverse talent. They would publish annual reports detailing their progress, subject to independent review. Around the room, expressions shifted from anticipation to unease. The junior partners who had mocked her earlier shrank back, realizing that their laughter had not only been misplaced, but dangerously short-sighted. Elara was not simply a guest to be tolerated or even an investor to be courted. She was dictating the future of their firm, bending its culture toward accountability. There was no trace of gloating in her voice, no vindictive edge. Instead, her authority radiated from her composure. She was not here to humiliate them. She was here to demand better. And that quiet defiance carried more weight than any display of anger ever could. The irony was complete. Hours earlier, they had doubted she even belonged in the room. Now, the room itself belonged to her. Every executive in attendance leaned toward her words, their careers tethered to her approval. Each check mark of her pen was a reminder that capital was not just money, it was influence. And influence could be repurposed as justice. The senior partner cleared his throat, his voice stripped of arrogance. "We agree to your terms." It was more than concession. It was capitulation. With that statement, the Blackwood Group, an institution that had once embodied exclusion, was forced to align itself with equity. Not because it chose to, but because it had no choice. For Elara, this was the victory that mattered. Not the visible discomfort of men who had insulted her. Not the whispers that now painted her as untouchable. The victory was that her pen had carved space for those who would follow. That billions of dollars would now flow into the hands of entrepreneurs who looked like the girl she once was, moving from house to house. Watching her mother fight against an unyielding system, the applause that finally broke out in the ballroom was polite, almost reluctant. But applause was irrelevant. The true triumph had already taken place, written into the fine print of the contract. In that moment, Elara Vaughn demonstrated that the most powerful form of revenge was not humiliation. It was transformation. When the final signatures dried, the night's energy shifted. The junior partners who had mocked Elara earlier stood stiff at the edges of the ballroom, their smirks long gone, replaced by the heavy silence of humiliation. No apology was spoken, but their lowered gazes carried the weight of it. The senior partner approached once more, this time with genuine deference. His handshake was firm, his words measured. "Thank you, Ms. Vaughn. You've given us more than we deserve." Elara nodded politely, then stepped away. There was no need to bask in their discomfort, no satisfaction in their unease. Revenge had never been the goal. Quietly, she slipped through the grand double doors, leaving the chandeliers, the whispers, and the false grandeur behind, for her. The true work lay ahead. That it was not lost on her that hours earlier a waiter had mistaken her for staff, offering her a tray as though she didn't belong. That moment of small humiliation lingered, not as a wound, but as a reminder. The same society that still defaulted to exclusion had now been forced to bend under the weight of her signature. Beyond the ballroom's opulence stretched a harsher reality. As of 2022, only two black women, Thasunda Brown Duckett and Rosalind Brewer, stood at the helm of Fortune 500 companies. That represented just 0.4% of corporate leadership. Meanwhile, studies showed that closing the wage gap for black women could generate up to 1.7 million jobs and boost the U.S. GDP by as much as $450 billion. These numbers were not abstract. They were the proof that equity was not just moral, but economic necessity. Later that night, Elara sat alone in her office, the city skyline glittering beyond the glass. The contract from the Blackwood Group rested neatly on her desk, a symbol of both victory and responsibility. She turned the same pen that had carried so much weight at the gala slowly between her fingers. It was never about ink on paper. It was about leverage, direction, and the courage to aim power where it mattered most. Her reflection in the window was steady, but her gaze was not on herself. It was cast outward, toward the generations coming behind her, toward the countless young women who would one day refuse to accept closed doors. Power, she knew, was not revenge. Power was the courage to redirect capital toward justice. What would you have done in Elara's shoes? Share your thoughts below. And if you believe in amplifying stories like hers, subscribe so we can keep echoing the voices that too often go unheard.